There are battles that decide kings, and there are battles that decide empires. In June of 1314, the fate of Scotland balanced on a single plain near Bannockburn. What the largest army in England could not see beneath the grass would destroy their formations before they even reached the Scottish lines. June 23, 1314. The English army marches confidently towards Stirling Castle. More than 20,000 soldiers, 2,500 heavy cavalry in full armor, archers, infantry, the largest military force England could muster. On the other side of the field, Robert Bruce waits with fewer than 10,000 men, mostly infantry armed with spears, almost no cavalry. The numbers tell one story: imminent Scottish destruction. This was not the first time Scotland had faced this brutal reality. 17 years earlier, at the Battle of Falkirk, William Wallace had tried to resist the English cavalry with defensive spear formations called schiltrons, dense circles of spearmen that could, in theory, hold cavalry at bay. Falkirk proved one thing: static formations were not enough. The English cavalry simply found angles. They waited. They wore down the defenses. And when the formations started to break, the cavalry slaughtered the Scots. Wallace lost. Scotland bled. Now, in 1314, Robert Bruce faced the same dilemma, the same enemy. England's decisive weapon: heavy cavalry. Knights trained from childhood to charge in tight formation, each protected by steel armor, each horse worth more than 100 peasants' lives. 2,500 of those knights were marching toward Bannockburn. Against them, Bruce had fewer than 10,000 spearmen, no obvious answer, no clear path to survival. But Bruce was not Wallace. He didn't plan merely to survive. He planned to destroy the English cavalry before it even reached his lines. And the weapon he chose was not steel. It was the terrain itself. The Bannockburn plain looked perfect for cavalry: wide, open, exactly the kind of ground where heavy horse could accelerate to full speed and smash enemy formations with sheer kinetic impact. The English commanders saw that field and felt confident. This would be another Falkirk, another Scottish massacre, another reminder that England dominated medieval warfare. What they did not see was what Robert Bruce did the night before the battle. While the English army camped, confident in its numerical superiority, Bruce summoned his men, not to drill, not to pray, to dig. All through the night, hundreds of Scots worked silently in the dark, digging pits across the entire front of the battlefield, each pit 3 feet deep and 3 feet wide. They weren't trenches for soldiers to hide in. They were traps for horses. The pits were laid out in a honeycomb pattern across the whole field where the English would advance. Systematic, calculated, not accidental. Each hole was then reinforced with iron stakes at the base, sharp points turned upward, designed to pierce the hoof of any horse that fell in. And then came the most ingenious part. The pits were covered: twigs, turf, grass, and moss, interlaced branches forming a surface that looked solid. From a distance, the field appeared intact. Normal green turf, perfect ground for a cavalry charge. But beneath that surface, hundreds of traps waited. A medieval minefield, invisible, lethal. Bruce didn't stop there. On the Scottish left ran the Bannockburn ravine, a deep, steep gorge that cavalry could not cross. That was the natural limit. On the right flank, there was woodland. Bruce ordered his men to block those wooded areas with felled branches and secondary ditches, preventing any attempt by the English cavalry to outflank him through the woods. The result was a corridor of death. The English cavalry would be forced to advance down the front, directly over the field covered with traps. No alternative routes, no room to maneuver, hemmed in by the ravine on one side and blocked woodland on the other. And when they charged, their formations would meet not solid ground, but a systematic pattern of collapse. And then, on the morning of the 23rd of June, Robert Bruce did something that defied all military logic. He positioned his men openly in the field, visible, apparently vulnerable. Schiltrons in formation, yes, but not behind walls, not hidden. Standing in the open, as if inviting the English cavalry to charge them. To the English commanders, it looked like madness or desperation. Scottish formations out in the open, exactly where the English cavalry could crush them with full impact. It looked like a gift, a chance to repeat Falkirk, to destroy Bruce and end Scottish resistance once and for all. They didn't know that Bruce had turned the battlefield into a mechanism. The Schiltrons were not just defensive formations waiting to absorb the charge. They were the bait, the visible component of an integrated system. The English cavalry would see vulnerable Scottish spearmen. They would charge with total confidence, and then the ground would give way under their horses before they could even reach the Scottish spears. This was Bruce's genius. Wallace had used Schiltrons statically at Falkirk defensive circles that simply waited for the attack. Bruce evolved the concept. His Schiltrons would do offensive work, but the defensive work, the destruction of the cavalry charge, would be done by the ground itself. Invisible pits would collapse formations, iron stakes would shred hooves, horses would fall, riders would be thrown from their saddles, formations would fragment into chaos, and only then would the Schiltrons advance, offensively, against an already destroyed enemy. Terrain engineering, psychological stratagem, offensive spear formations, all integrated into a single system designed to deny England's decisive advantage. Robert Bruce was not merely defending, he was turning an apparent Scottish disadvantage on the battlefield into a weapon. The English advanced on the morning of June 23rd, unaware that every step took them deeper into a trap they'd begun to walk into 12 hours earlier. They saw open ground. They saw vulnerable spearmen. They saw the chance to repeat Falkirk's victory. What they did not see was the honeycomb of covered pits waiting under the turf, the iron stakes waiting for the weight of armored horses, the ravine and blocked woodland confining their movements. The field that seemed perfect for cavalry had been deliberately transformed into a killing zone. But how exactly could shallow pits destroy heavy cavalry formations? How could 3-foot-deep traps neutralize 2,500 fully armored horsemen? The answer lay in the precise mechanics of cavalry destruction. In what happens when tight formations charging at top speed suddenly lose cohesion? When horses begin to fall not singly, but systematically across the whole front? The English cavalry was about to discover that terrain can be as deadly as steel, that engineering can defeat brute force, and that confidence built on past victories can blind commanders to carefully laid traps right under their feet. The answer was in the brutal math of cavalry coordination. When 2,500 armored horsemen charge across open ground, they don't ride as isolated individuals. They move as a single, coherent mass, each rider keeping precise distance to his neighbors, each line pressing on the one before. It is that cohesion that makes a heavy cavalry charge absolutely devastating on impact. It is also that same cohesion that makes the formation catastrophically vulnerable when the ground beneath it begins to give way. Robert Bruce's pits were 3 feet deep by 3 feet wide. Not deep enough to kill horses instantly, deep enough for something far more destructive, to break the synchronization, to turn a coordinated charge into disorganized chaos, to make every stumbling horse bring down 3 others. When contemporary sources described how the Scots dug holes with stakes, so the enemy could not pass without disaster, they were documenting precision engineering designed not to kill outright, but to disintegrate. Imagine the view from the Scottish line on the morning of June 23, 1314. The field before them looked perfectly flat, healthy grass growing uniformly across the plain, no visible sign of the hundreds of pits forming a honeycomb pattern across the entire front. Bruce had spent the previous night personally overseeing the operation. Each pit carefully covered with twigs, branches, peat, and turf. Each trap reinforced with iron-shod stakes driven at angles to prevent horses from recovering easily. The camouflage was so complete that even his own men needed constant guidance to avoid the traps while positioning. The English cavalry began their charge with absolute confidence. They had numerical superiority, superior armor, overwhelming experience. What lay before them was open ground leading to Scottish infantry formations that looked perfectly vulnerable. The ground seemed ideal for what heavy cavalry did best. Massive charges that smashed infantry lines through sheer kinetic force before pikes or spears could matter. The first horses hit the hidden traps at full charging speed. What happened next was not dramatic for any single horse. It was systematic across the whole formation. The leading horse's forehoof breaks through the turf and twig disguise, finds void where it expected solid ground. The half-ton weight of armored rider and horse instantly shifts from controlled motion to uncontrolled collapse. The horse stumbles violently forward, the rider is thrown, and the 3 riders directly behind have no time to react because they are galloping in tight formation designed for maximum impact. Multiply that collapse 100 times simultaneously across the entire charge front. The cavalry formation didn't collapse all at once. It disintegrated progressively as line after line reached the ditch zone. The front ranks fell first, creating living obstacles the following ranks couldn't avoid. Riders trying to dodge fallen horses ran into more ditches. Horses that made it across the first ditch stepped into a second one a few yards ahead. The spiked stakes Bruce had driven in turned recoverable stumbles into permanent falls, and crucially, all of this was happening while the cavalry was still about 110 yards from the Scottish line. That was exactly how the system was meant to work. Because Bruce hadn't just built traps, he had built an integrated anti-cavalry system that turned every English advantage into a disadvantage. The ditches did the defensive work. They broke the cohesion of the formation. They turned heavily armored attacking horsemen into immobilized victims. But the ditches alone wouldn't win the battle. They only created the necessary condition for what came next. The offensive innovation. Robert Bruce had carefully studied the precedent. 16 years earlier at Falkirk, William Wallace had used Scottish pike formations called schiltrons, dense defensive rings of spearmen with 13-foot pikes pointed outward in every direction. Wallace's schiltrons had held brilliantly against cavalry charges, but they had remained static, defensive, and when English longbowmen found firing angles, they slaughtered the motionless Scots. Wallace lost Falkirk because his tactic, brilliant defensively, had no offensive component. Bruce evolved the concept. His schiltrons would not stand still. They would advance. The ditches would do the defensive work of breaking the cavalry charge. The schiltrons would do the offensive work of destroying the broken cavalry. It was the integration of the two elements that created a system the English cavalry simply had no answer to. Passive defense through terrain engineering. Active offense through mobile pike formations, each element amplifying the effectiveness of the other. And there was a third component that made the system irresistible: terrain confinement. The Bannockburn ravine ran along the Scots' left flank, a deep cut in the ground that heavy cavalry couldn't cross. That meant the English couldn't outflank on the left. Bruce had blocked the woodland on the right with felled branches and secondary ditches. That meant the English couldn't outflank on the right. The only approach route was straight through the center. Straight through the area where every square yard was sown with hidden traps. Bruce had turned cavalry advantage into cavalry disadvantage. Open ground normally favored mounted knights over foot infantry. But when that open ground was secretly mined with systematic ditches, when the flanks were blocked by natural terrain and deliberate engineering, when defensive formations could counterattack against disordered cavalry, the whole tactical equation inverted completely. The English cavalry were experiencing that inversion in real time as their formations collapsed through the ditch zone. Riders trying to regroup found the ground unstable beneath their hooves. Officers shouting orders discovered half their units on the ground. The cohesion that made heavy cavalry devastating was completely destroyed before a single English horseman reached the Scottish line. And now, through the cloud of dust and confusion, the Scots began to move. The schiltrons advanced, not running wild like desperate infantry making a final charge. Moving deliberately in tight formations, 13-foot pikes pointed forward, each man holding precise position, advancing against cavalry that was no longer in coherent charging formation, against riders struggling to control horses on treacherous ground, against a force that had lost its cohesion and now faced the one weapon medieval cavalry could not defeat effectively: well-organized pikes moving offensively. The sound of battle changed. The thunder of hooves that had marked the start of the English charge was replaced by the metallic scream of pikes piercing armor, the cries of wounded horses, the Gaelic commands of Scottish officers coordinating the schiltrons' advance. The English cavalry, the arm that had dominated battlefields across Europe, was being systematically destroyed by Scots on foot. And the English longbowmen, that other decisive weapon that had ruined the Scots at Falkirk, couldn't help. Because the fighting was now too close. English cavalry intermingled with Scottish infantry at ranges where arrows would kill allies as easily as enemies. And the ground, the very ground Bruce had ingeniously prepared, had been turned to mud by thousands of hooves and feet. Archers trying to find effective firing positions were slogging through waterlogged earth, dodging fallen horses, avoiding hidden ditches they now knew lay everywhere. Bruce's integrated system was working exactly as designed. Edward II, watching from the English command post, saw his elite cavalry formations being destroyed by opponents who were supposedly inferior. He watched the battlefield turn into a tactical nightmare, where every English advantage had been neutralized. He saw the confidence he had brought his army to Scotland evaporate as the reality of collapse became undeniable. It was the turning point. Not because the Scots had found a single clever trick, but because Robert Bruce had built a complete system that turned disadvantages into advantages. That converted terrain into a weapon. That evolved static defensive tactics into coordinated mobile offense. That integrated hidden preparation with visible execution to produce results that seemed impossible when odds were calculated based only on numbers and equipment. The English cavalry was broken, not defeated for lack of courage, not outmatched by numbers, destroyed by calculated engineering that had precisely exploited how cavalry formations worked and designed a system to systematically disintegrate them. The hidden pits were not the whole plan. They were the first stage of a multi-layered system where each component amplified the others. Prepared ground created initial chaos. Confining the battlefield forced enemies into a death zone. Offensive schiltrons exploited the resulting disorder. And psychology, that English confidence built on previous victories, ensured they walked into the trap fully committed. Bruce had won the battle before it began through preparation his opponents could not see and could not imagine. He had turned open field into a minefield. He had evolved Scottish defensive tactics into coordinated offense. He had used every apparent disadvantage, every piece of confined ground, every traditional formation, as components in a war machine designed specifically to destroy cavalry. And it was working. Across the field at Bannockburn, the impossible was becoming reality. Scottish infantry in smaller numbers were destroying larger English cavalry. Foot soldiers were defeating mounted opponents. Hidden preparation was proving more powerful than visible military strength. And the battle that should have been an easy English victory was becoming a complete English disaster. But Bruce's genius went beyond this single battle. Beyond this single victory. Because what he had demonstrated at Bannockburn was not just how to win one fight. It was how strategic thinking could turn apparent disadvantage into decisive advantage. How intelligent preparation could multiply effective force. How integrating multiple tactical elements could create systems where the whole was exponentially more powerful than the sum of its parts. What was happening at Bannockburn would change not only Scotland's fate, it would change how commanders thought about war, about terrain, about the relationship between preparation and execution, about the possibilities of tactical innovation when convention was challenged by necessity and implemented through brilliant engineering. The destruction of English cavalry at Bannockburn was not just a tactical victory, it was the revelation of a strategic principle that would change how commanders thought about war, about preparation, about the relationship between apparent weakness and real strength. Because when the English cavalry formations collapsed on that field in June 1314, when the most feared knights in Europe were undone by pits they could not see and pike formations they did not expect to face, something much larger than a battle was being decided. The fate of Scotland. The end of English military dominance. The validation that strategic intelligence could defeat overwhelming numerical superiority. And Eduardo II, watching from the field as his army fell apart, understood the magnitude of the disaster before his commanders could fully process what was happening. The cavalry formations that were meant to be invincible were scattered across the field. The longbowmen who had slaughtered Scottish armies at Falkirk were useless in the chaos of close combat. And the schiltron formations that were meant to be static targets were advancing offensively through the devastated ground. The English retreat was not ordered. It was pure collapse. More than 20,000 men who had marched confidently to relieve Stirling Castle fled in disorder across the same ground they had crossed with such certainty. The cavalry that survived the hidden pits had no formation to reorganize. Scottish pikemen advanced methodically, exploiting every advantage Bruce had created through brilliant preparation. Edward II escaped, but the army he commanded was shattered so completely that the attempt to relieve Stirling was abandoned. The castle that had been the campaign's objective remained in Scottish hands, and the English military superiority that had dominated Scotland for decades was broken in a single day of fighting. But understanding the battle's outcome is only the beginning. Because what Bruce had shown at Bannockburn went far beyond specific tactics for a specific fight. He had shown that terrain could be transformed from a passive condition into an active weapon. That apparent disadvantage could be converted into decisive advantage through intelligent preparation. That integrated systems where multiple elements worked in coordination were exponentially more powerful than any individual component. Compare with Falkirk in 1298. William Wallace had used schiltrons, pike formations designed to withstand cavalry charges. But Wallace had used those schiltrons statically, defensively, like living walls that could hold but not advance. Bruce completely evolved the concept. At Bannockburn, the ditches did the defensive work. They broke up the cavalry formations before those formations reached the Scottish lines, and that freed the schiltrons to do offensive work, to advance, to press, to exploit the disorder the ditches had created. It was a brilliant integration of tactical elements where each component amplified the others. The ditches multiplied the effectiveness of the schiltrons. The bottleneck of Bannockburn multiplied the effectiveness of the ditches by forcing the English cavalry into confined space. The felled woods multiplied everything by removing flanking routes. It wasn't a trick. It was a system. And the psychological stratagem Bruce had orchestrated made the system even more devastating. Because the English didn't see just an open field. They saw an open field where the Scottish army appeared vulnerably positioned, where their inferior numbers and lack of cavalry made them perfect targets for the sort of attack that had destroyed the Scots at Falkirk. What Edward II and his commanders didn't realize until it was too late was that Bruce had deliberately created that illusion of vulnerability, that the field wasn't open but booby-trapped, that the Scots weren't vulnerable but prepared, that every element that seemed an English advantage was actually a component of the system Bruce had engineered. It was strategic deception operating on multiple levels simultaneously: visual, psychological, tactical. And when the English cavalry charged, when the most confident knights in Europe advanced across that seemingly favorable ground, every assumption they'd made about the battlefield was revealed as a calculated illusion. The historical impact of Bannockburn reverberated far beyond 1314. Because the English defeat was not merely tactical, it was psychological. The confidence that had underpinned English campaigns for decades was shattered. The belief that English heavy cavalry was invincible was destroyed. And the perception that Scotland could be conquered by military force was fundamentally questioned. In the years after Bannockburn, Robert Bruce consolidated Scottish control across territory the English had dominated. The victory gave legitimacy to his reign. It gave momentum to the cause of Scottish independence, and eventually forced England to recognize Scotland as an independent kingdom through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328. It wasn't just that Bruce won a battle. It was that he demonstrated Scottish independence was viable, that smart strategic resistance could defeat superior military power, that preparation and innovation could turn structural disadvantage into decisive triumph. And the principles Bruce validated at Bannockburn extended far beyond that particular battle. Far beyond Scotland, far beyond the Anglo-Scottish conflict, because what happened on that field in June 1314 revealed universal truths about strategy, about war, about the relationship between preparation and execution. First truth: smart tactics can overcome overwhelming odds. Bruce faced an army 3 times larger, with minimal cavalry against thousands of heavy horse, with limited resources against the region's dominant military power. Every conventional measure of strength suggested inevitable defeat. But he won. Not through strength he didn't have. Not through numbers he couldn't raise. But through strategic thinking that turned his disadvantages into components of an integrated system. The hidden ditches didn't compensate for numerical inferiority. They made numerical inferiority tactically irrelevant. Because when the English cavalry was broken before reaching the Scottish lines, the numbers Edward II commanded ceased to matter the way they had before. Second truth: terrain is not just where you fight, it's how you fight. Most commanders treated terrain as a passive condition, something that constrained or allowed movement, something that offered advantage or disadvantage based on natural features. Bruce treated terrain as an active weapon. He didn't just choose favorable ground, he engineered the ground to perform specific tactical functions. The ditches broke cavalry. The bottleneck channeled movement. The felled woods eliminated options. Each feature of the field was not merely favorable. It was functional, designed to perform specific tactical work as part of an integrated system. It was the use of terrain as a force multiplier, and it showed that intelligent preparation of the battle environment could be as decisive as any weapon or formation. Third truth: integrated systems defeat single-dimensional advantages. English cavalry was superior as an individual element, better equipped, more numerous, more experienced in cavalry warfare than any force Bruce could assemble. But cavalry operating in isolation was no match for the system Bruce had created, because that system didn't rely on any component being individually superior. It relied on all components working in coordination to create an effect greater than any part. Ditches plus confined terrain plus offensive schiltrons plus psychological stratagem equals the complete destruction of cavalry superiority. It was proof that smart integration beats isolated advantage. That thinking in terms of systems instead of individual components opens strategic possibilities that don't exist when you focus only on improving single elements. Fourth truth: the psychological stratagem amplifies mechanical advantages. The pits would have worked even if the English had known they were there. But they would have been much less effective, because cavalry aware of hidden pits could advance cautiously, could probe the ground, could avoid charging at full speed across suspicious terrain. But the ruse Bruce orchestrated ensured the English charged with total confidence. That they saw open ground and numerical superiority and assumed victory was guaranteed through conventional tactics. That confidence turned the pits from obstacles into mechanisms of destruction, because cavalry charging at full speed over concealed ground had no chance to stop or adjust when formations began to collapse. It was a multiplication of tactical effect through psychological preparation. And it demonstrated that the enemy's state of mind was as critical a component of the system as any physical element. So why does this matter? Why should a battle from over 700 years ago resonate today? Because the principles Bruce validated aren't specific to medieval cavalry or 14th century warfare. They're truths about strategy that apply whenever you face apparent disadvantage against superior force. Ingenuity and preparation triumph over mere strength. Hidden preparations create decisive advantages. Strategic thinking turns apparent weakness into real power. Bruce didn't have the resources to defeat England in conventional terms, so he changed the terms. He turned the battlefield into a weapon. He used clever preparation to multiply effective strength. He created a system where his disadvantages became irrelevant and the English advantages were neutralized. And when the battle ended, when the English cavalry was shattered and Edward II's army was in chaotic retreat, it wasn't luck or accident that determined the outcome. It was calculated strategic genius. It was brilliant preparation turned into devastating execution. It was validation that intelligence could defeat force when applied through integrated systems that amplified every available advantage. Bannockburn's hidden pits weren't just holes in the ground. They were the physical manifestation of a strategic principle: that the battlefield itself could become a weapon through deliberate preparation. That terrain could perform a tactical function. That smart engineering could multiply combat power. And the Scottish victory wasn't just the result of a battle. It was a demonstration that strategic thinking outperforms brute military advantage. That preparation changes probability. That tactical innovation can rewrite the rules of engagement when implemented with brilliance. Robert Bruce didn't defeat England through strength he didn't have. He defeated England by making that strength irrelevant through preparation they couldn't see until it was too late. That was the true power of Bannockburn's hidden pits. Not just that they broke cavalry, but that they represented a completely different way of thinking about war, about strategy, about the relationship between preparation and victory. And when you understand that, when you see how Bruce turned apparent disadvantage into calculated triumph, the question becomes, what other battles in history showed intelligent use of terrain? Where else do you see commanders using brilliant preparation to defeat overwhelming odds? Leave it in the comments. Because stories of tactical ingenuity overcoming brute force are the ones that reveal what strategy really means. And if you want more content on battles where smart innovation beat conventional superiority, subscribe to the channel. Next week, we're covering another battle where hidden engineering changed the course of history. Because in the end, Bannockburn teaches us that victory doesn't always go to the strongest. It goes to the smarter thinker, to the one who prepares more brilliantly, to the one who understands that the battlefield isn't just where you fight, but how you fight when you turn every available element into a component of an integrated system designed for victory.